Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday. It is March 13th. That makes it Friday the 13th. Horror dramatic music. But overlapping with our bright, semi-upbeat, and I don't know, news/inquisitive music bed that opens every show. Friday the 13th. Don't know how you feel about it. And didn't we have one last month? And I don't know what's going on here exactly. Usually there's a little bit more space in between these things. Then it gives you a chance to raise a new crop of Friday the 13th references. And this time we just haven't had a chance to do it. All right. Many things to catch up on. It is Friday. I spent Monday through Thursday telling you that I had stories that I wanted to share with you on Friday. Hopefully I didn't actually announce exactly which stories those were at any point during the week because I don't know anymore, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to them. There's a lot to do. We need to expand the format to 7 hours a day. But, would that really do anybody any good? You need to go out and gather up some of this news on your own so that when we come back in the mornings, we all are talking about, hey, did you see that thing last night? Oh, yeah. Right? Like, I don't know. If everybody, there's no water cooler chat, like, did you see the game last night? Right? And people don't go, yeah, saw it already. Who cares? We don't want to talk about it. Yes, we want to talk about it. Doesn't mean that this is the first you've heard of it. All right. It's not a breaking news show all the time, but Monday through Thursday feels that way because, well, stuff is happening all the time. There's a war going on, and depending on who you talk to, they may or may not admit that it's a war, depending on what kind of reaction they need to elicit from you. It's a very odd situation, as you know. And from the front, I guess, on that war, word is reached us last evening, and I guess we're getting what I guess passes for some clarification, a few more scattered details of what actually happened. Some more American casualties in the last day or so. 4 American service members killed, apparently, in a mid-air collision. At first, they only told us that there was a mishap of some kind involving a refueling tanker plane, a KC-135, if I recall, the cool, tactical sounding numbers and letters that we mashed together to sound like we have an understanding of the machinery somehow. But anyway, KC-135 fuel, flying refueler tanker kind of thing, as you've seen it all in all the footage, and another aircraft, and that was all they gave us. And that one of the aircraft landed safely, and one, as it said, crashed and went down in western Iraq, which, 10 years ago, that would have been a huge problem. Now you're in hostile territory. Now it's, I guess, I don't know what. It's not Iran. That's good news. I suppose their chances of being safely recovered, any survivors or the bodies of those who didn't survive from western Iraq, is better than it used to be. I don't know. Or maybe western Iraq was never a flashpoint. I don't know. We'll see what kind of news coverage we get. The interesting thing that struck me today is this morning, I understand the news is that the other plane, I was just trying to guess, he's trying to refuel somebody, something goes wrong. Obviously easy enough to understand, to visualize, and to get some mental picture of what was going on. But apparently the other plane was also a KC-135, at least according to one mention that I saw on Blue Sky. And I want to go and check this out for myself because that's difficult to imagine. How would that happen? Why would there be 2 refueling aircraft in the same airspace like that close to one another? I don't know whether that's actually true or not. And I'm going to look at every file photo that they've pulled to illustrate the news this morning shows, of course, a tanker plane refueling a smaller, like a jet fighter aircraft in the air. No real reason, I don't think, to imagine that a refueling tanker would be refueling another refueling tanker, but I suppose it could actually happen. Let me see what NBC News has to say. 4 of 6 U.S. crew members confirmed dead after refueling plane crashes in Iraq. Maybe we can get a better feel for the geography of where that happened and the whys and wherefores of all of this. The crash brings the number of U.S. service personnel killed since the Iran war began on February 28th to 10. An 11th died of a medical issue. I suppose it makes some sense to give us the details of separating those from combat deaths from medical deaths otherwise. Anyway, Patrick Smith reports this for NBC News. 4 of 6 U.S. crew members confirmed dead after their military refueling plane crashed in Iraq on Thursday while taking part in Iran war operations, the U.S. military said. I'm just thinking now about, I wonder about the geographic location of things. Western Iraq, I don't know what happens exactly, but I guess depending on your flight pattern, I would have thought maybe Eastern Iraq, which sort of borders Iran, might have been the place, and maybe I just had it wrong. U.S. Central Command said in a post on Twitter, because this is where we announce things nowadays, that the KC-135 plane went down approximately 2 p.m. Eastern time in Western Iraq, with 4 crew members confirmed dead. The statement didn't note the status of the other 2 crew members, but said that rescue efforts continue. I mean, I suppose their status is not great, but, you don't really have any information about that. They're alive and indicating that they are looking for rescue, I'm sure. The circumstances of the incident are under investigation. However, the loss of the aircraft was not due to hostile fire or friendly fire. CENTCOM said it was neutral fire. We're just flying bullets around in the atmosphere and no clear intention. You've entered the neutral zone. They're saying there was some sort of, I don't know what else, collision, mechanical failure, something like that. It said earlier, CENTCOM did, that 2 aircraft were involved in the incident and 1 landed safely. As is standard protocol in military deaths, the identities of those killed are being withheld for 24 hours until after the families have been informed. The crash means a total of 10 service personnel have been killed since the conflict began. Of course, the 11th, mentioned before, died of a medical issue. And then, reminding us that what is the atmosphere we're operating in here. Last week, Kuwait mistakenly shot down 3 U.S. fighters. Not easy to do by mistake, but none of the crew members were killed. That was good news. The KC-135 Strato tanker, which cost almost $40 million each, have been used as key refueling planes by the U.S. Air Force, Marine Corps, and the Navy for more than 60 years. It can also be used in medical evacuations, presumably not filled with fuel at that point. That according to Air Force, different configuration of the plane, obviously. Developing story, that's all it's got. What's the time on this post? 7:11 a.m. So I don't know. Still no confirmation that the second plane was also a KC-135. That would be rather confusing. So we'll just chalk that up to, social media chatter that may or may not have actually, been confirmed at any point. But we'll keep an eye on that. That's a developing story, although I have a feeling it will develop outside of our gaze for the rest of the day. Plenty of other things to get to. None of those resolved either. All of those are developing stories as well. But let me see if I can't scan through Instapaper here and spot the things that I've been thinking I would save for you for a Friday. A couple of interesting things. Not all of them were actually in the queue for Friday, but still make Good Friday stories nonetheless, even though, no, it's not Good Friday. I thought this one was interesting. From The Hill. Greg might find this interesting. Not that he's here to hear it, but sometimes he'll be reviewing the podcast and checking on. We got to see, Greg, whether or not we've been able to make our voice levels more even. Greg was mentioning that it sounds like his voice is boosted to some. Well, it used to be the other way around, and I'd get notes every once in a while. Greg's voice is louder than yours. You need to equalize them. And then other people, after I equalize them, Greg's voice needs to be less. That's blowing out my eardrums. So I don't know. It also has to do with the way everybody's settings are locked in. But hopefully we're doing well here. But Greg, you might find this interesting. Are you listening? If everybody else wants to hear it too, it's fine. From the Hill, Al Weaver. I don't know if we've read Al Weaver's work so far. A headline, Mullen departure. That's Markwayne Mullen, allegedly, well, he's the Department of Homeland Security Secretary designee at this point. But again, I haven't seen the paperwork. I don't know whether everything's been processed correctly. Wouldn't be the first time that it was alleged in the news that someone had been nominated to a position in the Trump administration, and it turns out that it just wasn't the case, and the paperwork was never completed. It'd be very difficult to imagine them not doing this paperwork, but it would be worth your while, I think, to demand that you inspect the paperwork and make sure that it's genuine and was actually dispatched by the president. You probably find something wrong with it. And that would be fun and embarrassing for them. Anyway, Mullen departure creates House Whisperer vacancy for Senate GOP. What's this about? It's not a real thing, of course, and it's interesting the way they describe it. It's not a formal position, obviously, and it's not even one that they necessarily knew that they needed before. But apparently the Republican conference there, the bicameral Republican conference in Congress, considered Markwayne Mullen to be a sort of liaison, unofficial liaison to the House Republican Conference. Perhaps he was the most recently elevated from the House Republican Conference to the Senate Republican Conference. And they thought, he's a crazy idiot. Maybe he'll be able to talk to the crazy idiots in the House. I think that's an interesting dynamic, something that we should be aware of. Senator Markwayne Mullen's pending departure from the upper chamber to lead, allegedly, the Department of Homeland, quote-unquote, Security, I'll say it that way, is creating a vacancy that Republicans wonder if they'll be able to fill. Unofficial liaison to the House. We don't know how to speak English with these guys. It's an informal role and one that didn't truly exist prior to Mullen arriving, which was like 60 seconds ago, as I recall. But the Oklahoma Republican has been a key player for the Senate GOP since he entered the chamber 3 years ago. 3 years goes by in a blink of an eye when you're an old man, I guess. Emerging as a top ally of Senate Majority Leader John Thune and turning into a source of power in his own right. He's a beard. I think that's the situation. And Republican guys worship that, apparently. Much of that was due to his relationships across the Capitol complex, developed during his 5 terms in the House. Really? God damn. All right. And now put to use to maintain bicameral harmony, which they don't actually need, but okay. And they don't actually have. And with key legislative items potentially coming down the line in the coming months, not that Trump will sign any of them, Senate Republicans believe the lack of his presence will be felt. I had to add that editorial comment about Trump not signing things. 1, because they didn't note it, and 2, because it's probably not even true anyway, and I wanted to do so for ironic purposes. People outside of D.C. think the north side of the building and the south side of the building talk to each other all the time, and that's not true, said Senator James Lankford, who previously served in the House and could also be doing this job, obviously, and just isn't for whatever reason. But that makes an interesting point, is you would think that people probably do have this idea that there's a lot of consultation back and forth, and there's a lot less than you would think. And there's even rivalry as between the houses, and they take this sort of weird pride in confounding one another sometimes when there's a disagreement, or jamming one another, I think, as we say in the legislative context. Anyway, it's hard to be able to maintain relationships across the building because our schedules are different. We function different. The structure of how we actually operate is so different. Markwayne had really good relationships in the House and the Senate, I guess. That's what they say. And that's going to be tough. Lankford continued, also noting his close relationships with the White House and across the upper chamber. It'll be a loss for the Senate for him going into this position, but it'll be a gain for the country for him to be able to do it. Well, he's a Republican. What do you think he's going to say? He's envious of his beard. President Trump's decision to fire outgoing Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and replace her with Mullen caps a quick ascent for the Oklahoma Republican. On top of Mullen's relationships with Trump and Thune, having served as his most public supporter during his leadership run, Thune's that is, he also has close proximity to Vice President Vance, having entered the Senate with him in 2022 and having a beard. Vance didn't at the time, I don't think. And then he did after a little while of just hanging out with Mullen. Isn't that something? He also counts Senators John Barrasso, no beard, and Susan Collins, no beard, as allies because he serves on the whip team and was recruited to the Appropriations Committee last year, respectively. He's really not merited any of these advancements, but like I said, beard. And so there you go. He goes on TV and rah-rahs Trump, and Trump demands his advancement as a result. But lawmakers have often noted that his ability to communicate with the House has been among the biggest things he brought to the table. Some in the Senate COP conference have even dubbed him the House Whisperer and believe he has been integral to the party's workings in recent years. Well, how's that going? There's not been much in the way of workings in recent years. He's a pretty valuable resource that way, said Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota, who entered the House alongside Mullen in 2012, noting that he's been wondering how that void gets filled in recent days. He is just sort of exceptional in the sense that he's ambitious. He loves being in the mix. He's gregarious in his personality, bold in his presentation. That's what Republicans think of him. But again, note the years here. So the people who entered the House with him when? 2012. We're talking about it, like, I guess the first wave of, first sizable wave of elected Tea Party members at that point. But coming in a presidential year, though. So that's of some interest, too. Anyway, just thought I would note that. So we're talking about teabaggers who went MAGA, who rode a second wave to a second level of advancement. And I guess he speaks that language. I talk crazy. Let me help. All right. Mullen was a frequent attendee at House COP conference meetings throughout his Senate tenure and routinely communicated the state of play and other dynamics to Republican leaders. So there's a couple of things I want to note about that. One, like, dude, you graduated 5 years ago. Why are you still hanging out here? There's a little dynamic of that, and which, may come from, being a freshman senator kind of sucks, but I'm a relatively senior House member. Maybe I can hang out and my beard will make people think I'm still there. But on the other hand, there's this. Who was the complainer that said, Langford, I guess? People think that there's a lot more communication going on than there is, and there really ought to be more communication between the houses, but there just isn't. We work different ways, et cetera, et cetera. Well, one thing you could do is, I guess, give credit to Mullen for this. Get up off your ass and go visit, and then there will be more communication between you. Like, that is an interesting thing. Like, the House members will tell you, well, one of the reasons that there's no communication with the Senate is the Senate sits there on the throne and waits to have people bring them tidbits of news as opposed to going out and meeting with people and having a connection that way. Not that House members don't do the same. Once they're elevated, say, from state legislature, they don't really communicate with state legislators back home very much either. The job is fairly demanding. You got to focus on what you're doing. But these guys are more or less in the same building. You can even ride a subway back and forth. It doesn't go all the way across, though. You should note that. You still have to walk through the Capitol. Most notably, though, about Mullen, he was the lead Senate COP negotiator with House Republicans from high tax states in search of a resolution on a cap for state and local taxes, the SALT stuff. Remember that, state and local taxes. The hard-won SALT deal was one of the keys to unlocking President Trump's Two Big Beautiful Bidets Act, of course. And by the way, I hope Mullen loves those bidets because he's got two of them coming. He's also served as a conduit during a battle between the chambers over whether to enact Trump's priorities in one massive reconciliation bill or two packages, having arranged a meeting between Thune and House Ways and Means Committee Chair Jason Smith, Mullen's roommate. That, that's a nice personal thing. Like, you should think those guys should meet and work it out. And they probably could. One has a scheduler. He can call the other one's got. They both have schedules, and they could schedule that meeting. But I suppose it would be of some help if Thune said, hey, new guy, beard, Jason Smith, right? I heard you were his roommate. Yeah. We chug all the time. And, we love watching the Thursday Night Football together. Would you give him he's not returning my calls. Can you get the meeting made? Yeah, sure. All right. That's helpful. Senators past and present have noted that prior to Mullen, there simply was nobody taking on a similar role, despite a significant number of senators previously serving across the Capitol complex. Like, there's a million of them, really, honestly. It's just odd that no one stepped into this. Nearly 24 current Senate Republicans were House members at one point in time. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but people weren't doing that before him. Former Senator Kirsten Sinema, who, I guess you could take her word for it on this, a longtime friend and former House colleague, told The Hill about his informal role, saying that Mullen has strong relationships with, quote, different subgroups within the conference that have paid off. There also isn't an obvious person to backfill that job. Senate Republicans have indicated they expect it to be a team effort. Nobody's going to be able to do what he's done, whatever it might have been, said Senator Katie Britt, although she probably said, nobody's going to be able to do what he's done. We have a number of members. Should I continue in a voice? It's too annoying. We have a number of members who have great relationships in the House. I think that they will obviously elevate those, obviously. It'll take a lot of people to fill the role of one person, and because it's not just one person, there's a connectivity issue there. I don't know if that makes any sense. Some have even joked that Mullen may continue to do that work despite his move into the administration. He could be like Marco Rubio and have 9 jobs, right? Have to get him. Those are big shoes to fill, and you can't fill them because they're going to buy you bigger shoes than you can actually fill, but good luck to you, I guess. And now that he was a secretary and he'll have portal-to-portal limo service, he won't have to go clomping across the Capitol to get from one subway to another in his new giant shoes that he'll be awarded shortly. Anyway, yeah, maybe he'll still hang around campus even though he's now in grad school. One possible replacement that senators floated as an eventual successor in the role is Representative Kevin Hern, a member of the House GOP leadership who's looking to replace Mullen in November. It's pretty simplistic thinking. Like, it reminds me of the time back in the early 90s when Tom Foley, Speaker of the House, Tom Foley of Washington, was defeated. George Nethercutt, if you remember that guy, I think is the guy who defeated him. And I remember reading in a paper that locally, like, people in Washington were like, yeah, well, I guess Nethercutt's the speaker now. Just like, I don't know, Trump captured the president of Venezuela. I guess Trump's the president of Venezuela now. It doesn't really work that way. Neither does it mean that the guy who replaces him in the Senate will also be a House whisperer. And not really clear you actually need one. Anyway, no matter who it is, though, they largely believe they have a tall task ahead. Or, like I said, big shoes to fill. It's something that we'll miss, Kramer continued, noting that there are a fair number of Senate GOP members who recently served in the lower chamber, but none that keep the connections the way he does. Didn't really make the transition, didn't really graduate and move on. Very interesting. I don't know. It's not hard news, certainly, but it's an interesting aspect of the human angle of the relationships between the conferences, same parties, conferences in both houses that you would think would have better coordination, and reminding you every once in a while that they really don't. And that to the extent that they have it, they think they're having it through Mark Wayne Mullen, who is not a great communicator, in my view, but does have a beard. So, I thought that was of some interest. That's why I wanted to throw it your way. Let's see. Moving on and heading back to our news roundup. Oh, yes, we should also acknowledge that something I don't have a great amount of detail on, but do have the AP report on, that yesterday an attacker rammed his probably truck, it says vehicle, but I'm going to guess it's a truck, into a Michigan synagogue. Apparently a naturalized citizen from Lebanon, according to the DHS. That makes the headline in AP, which is probably not great. But as I understand it, rammed his truck into a synagogue, jumped out with a gun, looking to do, whatever it is such people try to do, murder people, particularly Jewish people, and was shot dead by security. And it prompted an interesting discussion on Blue Sky, at least that I saw somebody pointing out, yeah, by the way, I guess some of you are surprised by this, but yes, synagogues, any synagogue that can afford it, really does actually have armed security in place because of things like this. And I don't know, I guess that grabs people by surprise. Of course, it doesn't take me by surprise. I've been to them, and we also have armed security as well, and it's a must-have, and it's like an extra tax on top of them. But a lot of people, a lot of houses of worship have decided to go this route in the past couple of years. Even those that I guess probably thought they were somehow immune from attacks and then found themselves attacked. So it's not unknown, but I think it's more widespread among Jewish synagogues just because they tend to be targets perhaps a little bit more often. But it's also it brings us to another interesting point. I happened to see the post from Aaron Biba, is it Biba or Biba, freelance science journalist with stories and work printed everywhere, but just happens to have mentioned, was the first one I think to bring the news to my attention yesterday, and saying, okay, so a guy rammed his car. He said car. She says car. I'm guessing it's still a pickup truck. Anyway, rammed a car through at the door at Detroit's largest synagogue and got out with a gun and was shot by security before he could massacre everyone inside, which was surely the plan. And yes, all synagogues that can afford it have security. And yes, it's exactly because of situations like this that they do. And very true. But I immediately afterwards did see and reposted along with it, and I think she noticed it and commented on it, from Daniel Siradsky, who writes, fun fact, the Department of Homeland Security, we were just talking about them, added restrictions last year to its nonprofit security grants program that helps synagogues and other Jewish institutions hire security that effectively make it so that liberal Jewish organizations can't qualify for those grants. Did you know that? Hi everyone, it's me, Commercial Guy, this time here to remind you that there are a number of ways you can support the show even without spending a dime, except for the dime that you spent on internet access so you could hear the show. Ignore that one. Anyway, I'm talking about feeding the evil algorithms that make the modern internet tick. When those YouTubers and TikTokers plead with you to smash that like button or subscribe so you never miss an episode, or even just leave a comment, it's because they know that it makes the algorithms more likely to recommend their content to other users. And they must know what they're talking about because their shows have millions of subscribers. And mostly those shows are terrible. We rule. So go find us on YouTube, find us on Libsyn, Stitcher or Patreon or Spotify, TuneIn, Apple, Amazon, Pandora, and then like us, love us, post a comment, ring the bell, punch the clown, shock the monkey, whatever you're supposed to do on that platform to make that algorithm think we're cool. Thanks so much for helping us blindly walk into Skynet's oblivion, but maybe with a little extra coin in our pockets. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I was scanning to see what kind of vehicle it was that the suspect smashed into the synagogue in Michigan, but that's the least interesting, I guess, of the details. Anyway, I guess this will be one of the stories I do a long story short on. There's not much more detail, I don't think, that we know at this point about what this is all about, but I wanted to, again, refer back to what Daniel Siradsky as self.agency on Blue Sky, who points out an article from the Connecticut Mirror, ctmirror.org. Connecticut Jewish leaders denounce new rules for federal security grants. Well, long story short, what are we talking about? What is it that makes it less likely that a liberal Jewish organization would get federal grant funds for security measures just when they need them, of course, is, well, for instance, if you have a mission statement that includes your belief in or support for DEI measures, the boys at Dodgy, of course, will have something to say about that, and of course that's too liberal and you can't have a grant, and therefore, so if you are inclusive of any number of minority groups, or regardless of sexual orientation or gender orientation, or, and you say we're actually going to be welcoming, and we won't actually pay any attention beyond the attention you want paid to it, to that aspect of your personality. You're welcome here as a worshiping member. Don't worry, you're safe here. You can do that. Well, you aren't safe here because the federal government is going to cut off your grant for security funds. Never mind finding out that a particular Jewish community is, let's say, not particularly enthused about the Gaza war, or not enthused to Fox News levels, and so therefore deserves no grant. I've seen it become increasingly difficult for Jewish communities to get a hold of those grants for multiple reasons. And even before they went on their anti-DEI kick, the Trump administration was for cutting back on those grant programs and freezing that kind of grant-making activity anyway, because God only knows why. Probably was dodgy people. Well, we can't go forward with this program because it specifically benefits religious people, and that's a minority, and that's DEI. Who knows? No one knows what their definition of DEI is. And as a matter of fact, to harken back to something we did at the end of the last show, playing you a clip from the deposition of Justin Fox, there's another one now in circulation, and I think the kid's name is Nathan Kavanaugh, not like the justice, but, well, pronounced the same, but I think spelled with a C. Just basically demonstrating similar disregard for everything, but his own, estimation of his own intelligence. And I don't know. Once again, quite disturbing. You should listen to some of those depositions. I'm sure you've seen the clips circulating online, and if you haven't listened, you ought to. I saw, let's see. If I remember correctly, was it Kevin Cruz? Yeah, I think just saying you should look. He was looking at the Kavanaugh one and saying, every professor recognizes this as the kid in class who hasn't done or refuses to do any of the reading, but nonetheless speaks up about everything and decides, to let you know that Greg will tell you
that's bullshit.
Everything is right, and we should get over the hang up of saying that, by the way, and I think we'll work on that, but Kevin was saying, the kid who thinks everything's bullshit anyway and hasn't done any of the reading, because, in this one clip, that is an exchange. What qualifies you at your young and tender age to decide what sorts of programs ought to be canceled and what research is wasteful, waste, fraud, and abuse, things like that? And whereas Justin Fox was pointing to, well, I just go back to the EO and cut and paste that and ask ChatGPT whether it matches, Nathan was saying, well, I don't think you necessarily have to be a subject matter expert of the area of the grants or the research in order to make those decisions. Anybody with, sufficient education who's read, widely would I think be in a position to make a judgment call like that. And they say, that's okay. And it's an interesting point to make. So what books have you read? What books were there that people read or prepared you for this job with by having you read? And at which point he says, well, there weren't any. I didn't read anything. So Kevin remarking, once again, you recognize the kid who hasn't done the reading but has lots to say about how he's got superior theories to all the people who have written the books and to you and to people who have studied this area extensively, and we'll hear none of it from you. And then, of course, gets himself in this position and ends up canceling your research or your grants. It's kind of like I was saying, the ultimate rate my professors or rate my professors on steroids, right? Instead, you got a B or a C in the class where you thought you deserved an A because you're such a genius, and you go online and give the professor a bad rating. He's a really hard grader, and he doesn't listen to input from students or whatever, whether that's the case or not. But the ultimate dream of any of these idiots is, of course, to find themselves elevated to a position where they can take revenge for getting a poor grade on the professor by canceling the professor entirely, having them be passed over for tenure, having their research grant dry up magically thanks to AI and Doge and the weirdos who were put in charge of that, taking revenge on the professors that didn't think they were geniuses. All right. Anyway, you should have a look, if you can, at those depositions. I think you'll find them interesting. All right. Other things to catch up on. Oh, you know what? Let me make mention of this. I've got a Hill article that reminds me that I wanted to do this. But tariffs also very much in flux. Just, we were reporting the other day the story, and I don't think we've resolved this one any more than we've resolved the hospital ship, the beautiful hospital ship being sent to Greenland. It's just not happening. It's just not a real thing. Nobody's kind of going back to that and saying, hey, that's weird that the president insisted that was true and hallucinated the problem to begin with. Maybe that's an issue we should follow up on. Like with tariffs, I'm going to impose 10% tariffs across the board because all of my other tariffs are illegal. Okay. And apparently that one actually took and paperwork was signed. And then a day later he decided, no, it's going to be 15%. And everybody says, well, I guess it's going to be 15% because, of course, he's empowered to do that up to a maximum, apparently, according to the court, or everyone's interpretation of what the court said, of 15%. So surely he's going to do that. But then they never followed up with any paperwork and didn't actually change it from 10 to 15%. And it took, I don't know, a couple of days, maybe even up to a week before people realized, hey, I haven't seen any paperwork on that 15. So what am I supposed to be paying now? And I read to you an internal, I think, email forwarded to me. Maybe it wasn't internal. Maybe it was from one of their outside vendors. But my brother Mark works in a job in which they're doing a lot of importing, right? Paying a lot of tariffs. And I think they get their outside advice on that kind of brokerage and import-export issues from a third party. And the third party was advising its clients, essentially, how to proceed. And I think was probably the first indication I got of the real detail of how serious the disconnect between the 10 and 15 and what was real and what wasn't actually was. So I have this article from The Hill, New Details Emerge on Trump Tariff Refunds. And remember, after having lost that case, everybody said, well, even before they lost the case, well, if it turns out that these tariffs were illegal and illegally collected, I want my money back. And I think for a while, the government's position on this in court was that's going to be so complicated that we shouldn't actually apply the law here. Yes, it was illegal for us to take all the money, but it's going to be so hard to figure out who paid that money and how to give it back to them. And of course, it's not because, these days when people transfer money to one another, they put their names on it. And here are the amounts and here are the dates and here are the reasons I gave you that money. And here's a record of that. And that's about all we got. I mean, that's everything there is in a financial transaction. And so it's actually quite easy to collate that information and hand it back and say, this is the refund that we're due. You could check the math, but here are the receipts. It's not difficult. So the court said, that's right, it's not difficult. You actually have to do this. So they've been working on a plan to implement, allegedly, this system of refunds. So the Hill article kind of sane washes what's going on here, I think. Zach Skonfeld. I guess we could do it this way. I could read you a little bit of the detail of this, and Mark's head will explode. And then when it's done exploding, I can get to you why his head is exploding by reading you these emails he's been forwarding to me. Because this makes it sound like it's an orderly process. And I think people who are actually dealing with this are saying, what, Yargle? No, that's insane. It has nothing to do with actually happening here. Here's the way they put it. The Trump administration's tariff refund system is more than 40% developed. Tell me when it's developed. 40%. I don't need a progress bar on your app. But okay. More than 40% developed. A customs official told a federal judge Thursday, and additional performance testing will take place in the next few weeks. Very short period of time. Businesses are pushing for speedy refunds on $166 billion. $166 billion that companies could have. It would be like cutting their taxes. It is cutting their taxes. It's giving them back illegal tax money. And gosh, wouldn't they be creating jobs or whatever the hell it is that they would do. This would be good for business, you would think, right? But Donald Trump is somehow reluctant on this one. It's good for business to put money in their pocket, except for when it used to be in my pocket. Anyway, $166 billion in levies that the Supreme Court struck down last month. But the administration has warned it will still take time to reroute the funds back to the roughly 330,000 importers who paid them. That's a relatively small number. For this whole country. In a Thursday update to Judge Richard Eaton, who is overseeing the process, Customs and Border Protection said the new software will have 4 components. Brandon Lord, executive director of the CBP's Trade Policy and Programs Department, wrote that each of these components is now between 40% and 80% developed. It's good. You're making progress. Obviously, it's not something that's all that easy to do, I guess. But from the business perspective, of course, I gave you my receipts. You have the money. Give it to me. It doesn't really feel the same as it does from the administrative side, in which we're about 80% of the way there in automating the task. So just hold on a little bit. It also doesn't address anywhere, naturally, the fact that those costs were very often passed on to consumers. So consumers paid those dollars as well, but they have no receipts. And even in cases where they do have receipts, they're not entitled to refunds for them. It is the people who made the payment in the first instance who have the claim on that money, even though it came in large part out of your pocket. So no, the court's ruling doesn't quite address that. Anyway, they go on to say that they're working on things, and the judge said that they'd shown satisfactory progress, and all of these things that are part of the consumer news version of what's going on here. And it makes it sound like it's actually very orderly. Let's see. Down here at the bottom is that the judge initially demanded the government take immediate steps to process refunds, but after hearing the CBP's practical concerns at a hearing last week, he gave them some breathing room on the timeline. Still, the judge has pushed the government to act with speed. These duties must now be refunded with interest, and the clock is ticking, which of course only means more interest. Eaton, the judge, has said the interest is upping the price tag by, is that the judge or is that someone else? I don't know. I think it is actually. Upping the price tag by about $650 million each month that goes by without refunds being sent. Just the magic of finance for you. $650 million for every month they drag their feet. So back in my emails, I have parked in here in a couple of places. I'll see if I can't find them all. But, you know what? I think he gave me a search term of sorts that might help me find. Oh, well, it's in the... that's not helping me. Okay. But let's see if I can search another way here and find these things a little easier. No, that's not really helping me much either. I starred one of them. So let's go and look at that. But I think there now are 2 emails out here from Mark that lay out some of the practical problems of all this, and naturally, I don't know what has happened to any of them. That's great. All right. Well, at a minimum, I can scan quickly through this. I don't know. I thought this was set up a little easier for myself, but of course, no. There's 10,000 emails every 10 minutes in this system here. So, okay. Although it does remind me as I'm scrolling through, I can make a quick thank you to Colin, one of our newest subscribers, who I guess is subscribing from overseas, or else just thought it would be fun to do some currency conversion. This is the first subscriber via Patreon that I've gotten where the amount comes through in pounds sterling. So that's very interesting. Are we welcoming you from the UK? And I guess if you're in the UK and you've been thinking, well, I'd love to support the show via Patreon and make regular or recurring monthly payments to support this work that I enjoy so much, but I'm in Britain. And as you know, something, tariffs, whatever, it's not going to work. But apparently it does work. It's very interesting. So thank you very much to Colin for joining up via, I think, if I'm doing the conversions in my head correctly, for one of our annual yearly subscriptions that save you some percentage. What did I fix it at? 15% on the not cover price. All right. Well, my thanks to you for bringing that forward. Did Mark send me this thing possibly in my personal email? Could that have been it? I do not know. Let me see if I can. Yeah, there we go. I think we can find it that way. All right, so I was looking for it in he knows my real email address, my personal email address, and has sent me these things here. So here we go. I think the last one, the last batch of them begins with this one. And it's very weedy stuff, but I think paints a different picture than you might get from the newspaper, which is certainly of interest on this show. All right, so this is the IEEPA, I-E-E-P-A, the Emergency Tariff Act, under which Trump claimed to have the authority to levy these tariffs, but doesn't. A refund reminder: configure your ACE, A-C-E, I don't know what it is, but maybe they'll tell us, the ACE portal account for electronic refunds. A little weird hitch to getting the refund. Why not send me a check? Here's my receipts, send me a check, or whatever. But apparently it all has to be done electronically, which is wise. It's not, silly to restrict it to that, but it's a little bit of a hitch, and apparently not everybody is aware of it. If your company paid these tariffs, a federal court has ordered CBP to refund those duties, this mass email to their client says, but there's a step that determines whether you can actually receive that money, and that may be of interest to you in the whole process, receiving the money. And according to CBP's own sworn declaration to the Court of International Trade, the vast majority of eligible importers haven't taken it. Oh no, that's not good. What did CBP tell the court? On March 6th, Brandon Lord, my lord, Brandon, executive director of CBP's Trade Programs Directorate, submitted a declaration to the Court of International Trade in Atmos Filtration, A-T-M-U-S, Atmos Filtration Incorporated versus the United States. Why are you against the United States, Atmos Filtration? Detailing the scale of the IEEPA refund challenge. His filing revealed the following. So again, this is Brandon Lord, the executive director of CBP's Trade Programs Directorate. 330,566 importers, that's the total number, have paid IEEPA duties or estimated duty deposits across more than 53 million entries, totaling approximately $166 billion collected. And that does sound like a lot, and I'm sure it's a lot of data, but then on the other hand, the dodgy teenagers have stolen the entire Social Security database and taken it with them to their new jobs. So, large data sets, usually not a problem, except for these guys, because it means they have to give you money. So now it's a problem. As of February 6th, CBP issues all refunds electronically only. There are no paper checks. Of those 330,566 importers, only 21,423 entities, roughly 6.5%, have completed the process to receive refunds electronically through ACE. I still don't know what ACE is, but assume it's an acronym that makes a tremendous amount of sense, financially speaking. It's an interface for getting your refund. CBP has already been unable to process 7,700 refunds for 2,897 importers since February 6th because those companies had not completed the required setup steps. Those refunds were rejected. And I think they get down to the point later on in pointing out that's rejected. That's not start over and get it right and we'll give you the money. That's a no from CBP. You're going to have to do extra fighting now to get your refund, I guess. This is really something, though. Well, what an interesting bunch of statistics. You would have thought this would have been a great interest to the Hill, but I don't know how widely these things are being circulated or what the provenance of these stats are. But 330,000 entities are owed refunds, and only 21,000 of them have even bothered to read the bulletin that says, here's how you get your money. I guess they're very busy people. So that last point bears repeating. Refunds aren't being held in a queue waiting for importers to catch up. They're just being rejected. CBP is building a new system, but it only works, and it's not even ready yet, it only works if you're ready. Lord's declaration, that makes it sound a lot more important than it is. It's like the 10 Commandments, but the guy's name is Lord. Lord's declaration also describes CBP's plan to build new ACE functionality specifically designed to streamline IEEPA duty refunds. Rather than processing 53 million individual entry-level refunds manually, the new system is designed to aggregate refunds by importer. Sensible, right? CBP estimates it will have the new functionality ready in 45 days. The process, as CBP describes it to the court, will work roughly as follows. The importer files a declaration in ACE listing entries on which IEEPA duties were paid. ACE validates and recalculates the duty owed without IEEPA tariffs. CBP certifies the refunds, and the Department of Treasury issues payment electronically. That last step, electronically, is the critical word. If your ACE account is not configured to receive electronic payments when the system goes live, you will not receive your refund. That's why I guess it's important to follow the progress. When they say they're 40, maybe 80% done, which one is it? Click here in this email if you want. You can just click right through to download the CBP ACE portal for electronic refunds guidance document from December of last year instructing you how to set up your portal to receive funds, so they're not leaving you out in the cold. Here's what you need to do now. It says CBP is due to file a report to the CIT, Customs, I don't know who that is, CIT, not counselors in training the way we used to think camp days, but CIT by tomorrow afternoon, so this would be just the other day, and it's probably already happened, informing them of their progress towards programming for IEEPA refunds, but don't wait for that status report or assume that they'll be longer in delivering than estimated last week. To receive your IEEPA refund when CBP's new system is ready, your company must have an active ACE portal account, and you must upload your bank information to your ACE portal to receive your refunds. If you're all the importers listening to the show, if you are paying your duties through ACH directly to CBP from your bank account, this does not, by itself, mean that you are set up with CBP to receive your refund electronically. You pay them electronically, that's fine. The us pay you, that's different. You got to sign up. This is not something your customs broker does on your behalf. It is a step your company must complete directly. If you are unsure whether your account is set up or whether it's configured correctly, contact in this case, this company is Western Overseas. Contact your representative today. They can, and I'm sure your broker too can, walk you through what's needed to help you ensure you're in a position when CBP's programming changes to issue those refunds is completed. In other words, it's a lot more work than you think, and if you don't do it right, you're not going to get your refund. I think that's an interesting way that the Customs and Border Patrol folks may end up sitting on a lot more of these refunds and keeping them than you would think. There's an update on this from a couple days later. Middle East update. Oh, okay. It's not on the tariffs thing, but just basically, oh no, nothing you're importing is getting to you because what's closed? The Strait of Hormuz. What passes through there? Apparently everything. Middle East update they sent here. Disrupted freight, increasing fuel prices. Maybe this is probably the best way to keep an eye on what the business and importing community is getting in their mailboxes versus what we're reading in the papers. Which one is the better description? I don't know. But Middle East conflict disrupts global air and ocean freight, and U.S. fuel prices are climbing fast. That you probably would have guessed, I think, from seeing the news. I don't know how much this diverges from the news reporting we've heard. I will review this one, but I just thought it was interesting that people whose businesses are being affected by these news items we're reading and analyzing from a political standpoint may be getting a very different idea of what's going on. And very often it's details and logistics and minutia that are very important to making the policy decisions that would help, but that we doubt very much that the Republican administration, the Trump administration, is actually reviewing and taking into account. But it's always interesting to have that view and perspective. So I'll leave it for now and maybe return to it as the war progresses over the weekend. I think the war fighters in the region also understand weekend chaos is meant for them too. Never know what the president is going to say the mission is and whether or not it will change. Let me exit to the top of the hour with something always worth checking in with. Garrett Graff, who writes over at his Doomsday Scenario, maybe Substack, can't tell anymore these days, but everybody's hiding the Substack part of the URL. Trump surprised to find he's at war in Iran. I think we all recognize kind of what's going on there and what he means by that. Once his not even half-baked plan failed to materialize in Iran, it's clear that there's no plan B. Yes, but tell us specifically, Garrett. All right, he does that. That's the nature of this entry, or all of his entries. The hardest thing for the media to wrap its hands around over the last year is that Donald Trump has no plan for anything ever. This is what we were talking about the other day when we read the comments about, stop saying that he's changed the strategic plan or has walked back the policy. There's no such thing. It's just things he blurts out wherever he is. Time and again, national pundits and the White House press corps invent a logical Donald Trump who sets, announces, and later, quote, changes real, quote, policies or, quote, plans, failing to convey what is clear to anyone who is actually following events closely. In each public appearance and social media post, the Mad King Donald Trump spouts a string of words devoid of meaning or purpose that may or may not represent anything at all. Every single thing he says may, at any given time, be taken as an official hardline policy of the U.S. government, the opening gambit of a long, flexible negotiation, or a random pronouncement that will never be mentioned again. See hospital ship and Greenland, for instance. He actually does make mention of this, I think. It's impossible, though, to know in real time which is which, especially so if you're actually in the U.S. government and in charge of translating his words into actions and plans. It was, after all, barely 2 weeks ago that Donald Trump announced out of the blue that he was sending a U.S. Navy hospital ship to Greenland to provide medical care for, quote, sick islanders. Nobody knew what the hell it was, and nobody has mentioned it ever again, except us. All right, welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So, we're in the middle of reading this piece from Garrett Graff, just summing up events and mentioning the fact that, more and more people are beginning to realize that just because the President of the United States is making this comment to the press, ordinarily that meant something. I guess this is a sort of analog to the presumption of regularity or the various other Trump and paperwork problems that we point out all the time. Mark Wayne Mullen is going to be the new DHS secretary. Okay, I mean, we understand that and we report that because actually the paperwork normally presents no hurdle whatsoever to moving from pronouncement to making that the actual fact. But in this administration, we don't know whether there's any connection between what gets said and the paperwork that makes something fact. We usually ignore it because, like we said, there's a competent person somewhere taking care of those steps and no reason to believe that the president would get out ahead of the machinery of making that work. It's just we now have a president that doesn't understand that there is such machinery, or sometimes the machinery that's there knows that that can't happen, right? I'm sending a hospital ship to Greenland. As much as we'd like to accommodate you, sir, that's impossible. We can't do it. And there's no, return to the subject. Like, one, you owe us an explanation of how it is that you blurted that out and why. And two, just retract it and say it was a giant mistake and whatever. But three, and yes, until you do, I would say, as a journalist, if I was one, I reserve the right to compare any policy pronouncement to the Greenland situation until you clear that up. Sure, you say, whatever, X, Y, Z. You say you're pardoning someone. I don't believe you. Show me the paperwork that makes that true. and then I can report it. And everything else just has to be purported until then, because, you did this last week, and that's definitely not true. So how do I know which one is realistic and true and which one is not? But by the way, update for you on the Greenland thing, just to finish out what Garrett Graff had said, right? Remember, it's barely 2 weeks ago. It does seem like an eternity. And that's why news reporters aren't returning to it. That's old news. But it's new news that still isn't happening, right? Barely 2 weeks ago that Trump announced out of the blue he was sending a U.S. Navy hospital ship to Greenland to provide medical care for, quote, sick islanders. And there were no sick islanders. There was a sick sailor. But, the whole thing was hallucinated. The Danish and Greenland governments were baffled by what he meant. The U.S. government never even bothered to try to explain the presidential announcement. That's the part that bothers me. And at the time, both U.S. hospital ships were in dry dock, undergoing repairs. Let's check back on that, shall we? At least Garrett will do it, right? Today, there's only one hospital ship at sea, and it recently transited the Panama Canal and is now off the west coast of Mexico, apparently headed toward a long-term repair and overhaul in Portland, Oregon. So it sounded like they were both going to be tied up in dry dock in Alabama for the long term. But as it turns out, one of them is there long term. The other one stopped briefly on its way to the west coast for repairs they're doing there. I don't know why there and not Alabama, but hey, what can you do? The decision is made above my pay grade, presumably, and I get no pay from the government, so anybody's above my pay grade. But apparently they stopped for short-term repairs to their ballast tank, I found out, according to a linked article from Garrett's piece here. But so it's back at sea, but does anybody know, if you're in Alabama, what direction do you have to head to get to Greenland? And if you don't know your geography and your terminology, like, golly, I don't know anything about directions, I'll put it to you this way. I think this is in terms anybody can understand. If you want to get to Greenland, the best way to go from Alabama is toward Greenland, as opposed to away from Greenland. Now, the globe, it's round. You could sail all the way around and say, I'm looking to approach Greenland from the northeast. That's the way I'm going to do it. But just to surprise everybody. So throw you off. I'm going to go down south through the Panama Canal and up the west coast of the United States. Although right now I'm off the west coast of Mexico. It takes a long time for these ships to move. I don't know. It just seems kind of basic. If you were going to Greenland, I would think you would be, I'm not a ship's captain. I'm not a sailor, nothing. But just the basics of boating, I guess. Point boat toward Greenland. If not pointed toward Greenland, destination is other than Greenland. That's what I'm taking away from it. Now, there may be logistical nuances I don't understand. Sometimes you'll point towards something else briefly and then turn the boat later on or whatever, but not in this case. And still, though, no real effort to say, by the way, Mr. President, what the effing F about that? Like you made a big-time pronouncement, like you were implementing some kind of a program, and the problem you thought you were addressing doesn't exist. The boat you said was already on its way is not on its way anywhere, and now that it later on has gotten underway, it's in the opposite direction. Like, are you going to address this at all? No. So, no further mention of Trump's tweet. The entire episode just came and went, baffling as ever. Garrett continues, I mentioned the hospital ship because the U.S. is now 2 weeks, and it's only been 2 weeks since then, is now 2 weeks into running a major regional and global conflict with the same level of haphazard statements, strategy, and planning, and the U.S. media continues to cover Trump as if he had some actual semblance of a plan or strategy for what to do in Iran, a country he's clearly already bored with invading, but now has created such an international crisis that he can't quite just walk away as he's become used to doing. This is Taco Trump at his most dangerous. And I don't think I put away the article, but I did see someone circulating something the other day basically that Trump is just tired of this thing and he doesn't want to mention it. It was like under the headline of no one's mentioning the war, and Trump isn't talking about the war, or that he's tweeting or posting on Truth Social as frequently as ever. But for a president that's involved in a war, it's like 11, 10, 15% of his posts are actually about the war he's supposedly overseeing. He's just not interested. It was not Venezuela, so now he's done. I've seen the explosions. What else is there? The administration never had any real justification for its war with Iran, and indeed it has offered something like 10 ex post facto justifications. But leaving aside why we went to war, there's a link, by the way, to the 10, or, that apparently justifies the number. It really is about 10, not just, that's a big number, well, let's throw that one out. But leaving aside why we went to war, it's even less clear what victory looks like. Every day this week, and sometimes multiple times a day, Donald Trump has offered shifting statements, declaring the war somewhere between very complete and not enough. Both of those quotes, obviously, each utterance has generated headlines as if they shed any light on the overall trajectory of the war, which might last anywhere from a few more hours to 4 to 5 weeks. Or, some say, sometime in September, if you believe the time frame that U.S. Central Command is recruiting additional intelligence support. It's clear that none of Trump's statements are operative or even necessarily insightful in any way. The war will continue up until the moment it doesn't. But that's what's become even more clear in the 2 weeks since that Donald Trump doesn't understand and isn't remotely interested in understanding the reality of the situation in Iran. The administration's entire gamble appears to be that Iran would be Venezuela. They could conduct a single night of strikes, decapitate the leadership, and then, through geopolitical magic, a Delcy Rodriguez figure would emerge to lead Iran peacefully and cooperatively. And that, too, has been part of the analysis, that people noting the weird lament from Trump. Well, all the people we were thinking might succeed him were also killed. And he seemed genuinely kind of bummed out about that. And I guess he really thought, one of them will be a Delcy Rodriguez and we'll want to do a deal. What, none of them? It's not just because they were all dead. If they had lived, they also wouldn't want to do a deal. They're different people. It's a different country. I mean, it's just they're their own sphere of influence, not the way Venezuela is here. Anyway, now that not even half-baked plan has failed to materialize, it's clear that there's no plan B. Quite the contrary, we seem to have a U.S. government that wakes up each day completely befuddled and surprised to find it's involved in a conflict in Iran. So this was supposed to be one day. Instead, we have a government that has been repeatedly surprised by the most basic and foreseeable consequences of its own actions, like Marco Rubio's days of stumbling over how the U.S. had no plan for evacuation flights for Americans caught up in the fighting across the Middle East, and their belated planning efforts to reduce gas prices. Of course, he's stumbling over everything because his shoes are too big. As Michael McFaul noted on Twitter, reporting tells us, this is where the nitty-gritty of it makes it obvious that there's no plan, like literally none. Reporting tells us that there is no real National Security Council-led interagency process operating in the Trump administration. They don't even have a full-time NSA. Remember that, too, is Marco Rubio's job. So that probably explains why, 1, the mission of the war is ill-defined, 2, the comms rollout was a mess, and 3, they didn't think of all the second and third order effects of war because the memo that normally you would get was never written, let alone discussed in the White House Situation Room, as would be the tradition of any past administration, Democratic or Republican. They didn't meet in the Situation Room and decide or discuss. So how could this go? How does it go if it goes well? How does it go if it goes poorly? The comms rollout was a mess. And these are the sorts of things that Hegseth dismisses as technicalities. Look, we just kick ass and take names. Or what's the other one they say? Well, I'm here to kick ass and chew bubble gum, and I'm all out of bubble gum. Right? Well, we kick ass and take names, except I forgot my pencil, And also, I'm doing this job remotely, so I can't actually kick anybody, and I have no interest in taking names. I don't know, but he thinks it's a nerdy sideline. Like we should have a communications plan on this. Killing people is what we're doing. Why communicate anything? Well, okay, what are you doing? Why are you killing people? I don't know. That's writing too. I don't like it. The New York Times, or the new New York Times TikTok of the Trumpian miscalculations, linked herein, that led us here is eye-popping. You may have seen this thing, and if so, if you haven't, it's how Trump and his advisors miscalculated Iran's response to war. If you haven't read it, you've certainly got the vibe, I'm sure. So, they say, inside the administration, some officials are growing pessimistic about the lack of a clear strategy to finish the war. But they have been careful not to express that directly to the president, who has repeatedly declared that the military operation is a complete success. That does not sound like a conflict that is going well, or likely to turn around anytime soon. That, of course, is leaving aside the week's other big story. The top figures in the administration are apparently walking around in ill-fitting shoes because they're too embarrassed to tell Donald Trump their correct shoe size. I don't think that's the correct dynamic. And Pete Hegseth is so disliked, or rather, Pete Hegseth so disliked how he looked in press photos at the Pentagon, from the Pentagon briefings, that he's no longer allowing photographers into his briefings. Again, all signs of a smooth, well-functioning team. Anyway, I think it's more than that they're too embarrassed to tell him the correct shoe size. They're just, I guess they understand that they're being tested here, and they're just shutting up and taking it. By the way, I've noticed Hegseth does not have a pair of those shoes. I guess Trump thinks his shoes are acceptable, those weird beat-up brown things that he wears, or maybe they're shinier than they look. I don't know, in the pictures. But or he's staying away and hiding his feet from Trump. Very smart. Most of all, it appears Donald Trump doesn't understand the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point at the end of the Persian Gulf that even high school model UN players understand is vital to the functioning of the world economy and oil exports. It's not an unknown. It's not a new thing we discovered, right? He has been shocked and surprised by Iran shutting down the choke point to oil tankers, and so completely shocked that Iran is now attempting to mine the strait that the U.S. actually, and here you're hard-pressed to describe how our activity, our military policy would be different if we were literally just selling the rights to run our military or handing it over to Putin. Seriously, ready? He's so completely shocked that Iran is now attempting to mine the strait that the U.S. actually pulled its minesweepers out of the Gulf just weeks ago, after literal decades of deploying them there to counter this very threat. But don't worry, the U.S. has 4 other minesweepers in Japan. Great planning. Right? All of this stuff is really working well. I challenge you to come up with a better explanation for why, after decades of deploying minesweepers in the Persian Gulf, President Trump's military moved all of the minesweeping capability out of the Gulf within weeks of attacking the Gulf, whereupon we had to know that Iran was going to start mining the Gulf anywhere, and if they were going to do it anywhere, it was going to be in the Strait of Hormuz. But pick your location in the Persian Gulf. Why are you moving the minesweeping capability out of there? I have no other explanation for it. And people make this comment wryly all the time. If Putin was commanding our armed forces, I don't know how it would look any different. I can think of no better description of what happened here. Trump's latest effort to reopen the strait, to basically have the U.S. act as insurer of last resort, turns out to be easier said than done, according to the Wall Street Journal. We referenced that one yesterday. Since the U.S. doesn't actually know anything about the insurance market led by Lloyd's of London, it is now trying to underwrite. Why would you learn? Right? What's surprising to me, though, is that the news media is covering all of this uncertainty in sham-handedness. I like that. As if it's all part and parcel of a normal conflict. I've written time and again since Trump took over about how the media knows the difference between covering a new story and a news event. The U.S. chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan was a news event. So far, the war with Iran continues to be covered as a big news story. This is the front page of the Washington Post this morning. No banner headlines, no major blaring alarm bells, just routine coverage of something that's not a war. You know, you'll have to visualize or imagine in your head, but, you know, Iranian school was on U.S. target list, may have been mistaken as military site. War, these are the headlines on the Washington Post page. War against Iran expands into Lebanon as Israel battles Hezbollah. 2 U.S.-based satellite companies restrict access to Middle East imagery, etc., etc. The New York Times, similar today. Iran's new supreme leader issues defiant statement. You know, all of these things, not president totally disconnected from reality. Same for CNN. Notice anything missing? There's nothing in any of these homepages that makes clear how lost the U.S. is, nor any particular sense of urgency or banner headline. I wish the media would start to trumpet what seems clear to anyone actually reading the media's own coverage. Every news story needs to start leading with the fact that Trump is lost at sea. But, of course, then you would be accused of being disloyal to the United States. Pete Hegseth just this morning criticizing CNN for saying things like war in Iran intensifies. He was mad because it didn't say United States kicking everybody's ass really super hard or whatever it was that he wanted to see done. Which, by the way, in addition, then he went on to say, well, thank God the Ellisons are taking over at CNN and soon we'll get more favorable coverage and it can't come too soon, which everybody decried as a horrible departure from, you know, normalcy in the United States, which is true, but by the way, also points out that not only does Pete Hegseth not understand his current job, he also misunderstood his previous job. He's not got a great record of performance in employment. But we knew that, and they did it anyway. So, okay. Garrett continues on here. I wish the media would start to trumpet what seems clear to anyone who's actually watching. Trump's lost at sea. He has somehow stumbled his own way into a disastrous foreign war of choice with profound economic and geopolitical consequences likely to unfold for decades to come and rebound terribly on the United States and across the Middle East. It is a mistake of such epic proportions that the Bush administration's war in Iraq appears increasingly likely to turn out to be America's, quote, best war in the Middle East in the 21st century. Can't believe there's supposed to be such a thing, but I want to focus too on one other point, the cost of the war. The Pentagon is telling Congress today in an initial partial tally, I guess a couple days ago, the partial tally of the monetary cost of the war. The cost in human lives, instability, and reputation is, of course, much higher. But the first week of the war cost about $11.3 billion, an enormous number that's hard to even tally. Put that in context, it's a number larger than the annual state budgets of some 16 states, including Iowa or New Mexico, and represents roughly the entire annual state budget of Nebraska, Oklahoma, or Alabama. More than that, though, is how we as a nation spend money on war and immigration enforcement, quote unquote, as if it's endless, while skimping on all the expenses that actually help our fellow humans. We've already added this past year $150 billion to the defense budget, while destroying and dismantling the $35 billion we spent on the U.S. Agency for International Development. As I wrote and investigated a couple weeks ago, the $52 billion construction and procurement budget for Customs and Border Protection is so large that it represents more than the defense budgets of Hungary, Austria, the Czech Republic, Switzerland, Finland, Greece, Belgium, Romania, Denmark, and Norway combined. Hard to believe, but there it is. That's just all those countries combined, still not as much as we're spending on construction and procurement for the Customs and Border Protection Force. What? The remaining money to spend this year that CBP has to spend equals the entire GDP of Estonia. I think a lot in moments like this of the 1953 speech by Dwight Eisenhower about the costs of war versus peace. And the quote, very frequently circulated these days, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed, Eisenhower told a group of newspaper editors, "This world in arms is not spending money alone. It's spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It's 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It's some 50 miles of concrete pavement. We pay for a single fighter with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. What could that's the end of the quote, but what could 11.3 billion have bought us if we spent it here at home? A few data points. We spent in the 2020 and 2021 school year a total of about $21 billion to feed near universal school lunches and breakfasts across the country during the pandemic, a life-changing educational investment for children. Or today, $11.3 billion would cover putting 1.4 million on Medicaid or into affordable housing. That's the entire population of New Hampshire or Maine, or in other words, the New Hampshire state legislature, right? Remember all of this next time you hear a politician tell you there's not enough money for this or that social safety program. It's never that there's not enough money. It's that they don't want to spend it here to help people. Spending money on war and border security is a choice. All right. So yes, it was took a shift at the end there, but important context, and that's what we read Garrett Graff for. So I don't know. I thought that one very interesting, and starting with the problem of, hey, the president is insane and detached from reality, and then getting around to what is this costing us? Though it would be costing us the same amount of money if we had a sane president who had a real war plan. But then at least we would have some explanation for one guy's idea of why we were doing this. And we don't even have that. The one guy doesn't have any idea. He may not have any idea that we're doing it. All right. Let's see. A couple of other things here to add to the mix. I guess we're getting closer to break time again. Let me read you this summation. I thought it's always nice to check in with Liz Dye, again, writing here at Law and Chaos Pod about the depositions to which I pointed your attention from the Dodgy Boys. She just has an interesting take on it, and it can take us into the break. Dodgy Bros had more fun burning down government than testifying about it. This is sort of a great accountability moment. Not only do we get to see this stuff, but remember, this is all part of a lawsuit against them, not only seeking to reverse the decisions that they made, but pointing up the complete lawlessness with which the decisions, if they were decisions, were made. And it's very interesting. They were grinning ear to ear when they were doing these things, and probably could hardly believe their luck at being put in charge of the United States government at age 23. But like Kevin Cruz was saying, these smirking jackasses who were just last year in your class as undergrads, who thought they were the smartest people not only in the room but in the world, were suddenly handed the world. And what did they do with it? Certainly wasn't a sudden realization that they didn't know everything they thought they knew. They just did what you probably would have predicted in class, went straight ahead with their stupid plans. Subheader here, none of this would have been legal if they'd sent competent adults, but the fact that they sent smirking little shits makes it so much worse. Liz, you have it right. And we'll pretend we're not afraid to say so. In this, by the way, I'm watching Nate. It's Nate. I don't think, did I say Nick maybe? But I don't know. Nate Kavanaugh chewing gum throughout the deposition. Chewing gum and drinking coffee, which yum. Anyway, in the spring of 2025, the Elon Musk's Dodgy slashed and burned, the shouldn't be in there, but it is. Elon Musk's Dodgy slashed and burned through various congressionally created and funded federal agencies, systematically destroying them as part of an effort to, well, who the hell knows? Something deficit. Blah, 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 waste, fraud, and abuse. Eradicate, DEI. And literally, it did come down to that. Musk's code bros knew they had a mandate from the White House and force field that made them immune to any law or regulation. And so, armed with nothing more than their laptops and unbridled arrogance, they set out to hack the federal government to pieces. On March 12th, the Code Monkeys descended on the National Endowment for the Humanities, an independent agency established by Congress in 1965 to, quote, foster and support a form of education and access to the arts and humanities designed to make people of all backgrounds and wherever located masters of their technology and not its unthinking servants, which is a little on the nose, to be honest. I think quite right about that. And one of the things that really comes through from these depositions, by the way, is that these are kids that were educated, to the extent they were educated as STEM students, and they're computer science majors, and we just need to know practical knowledge, and probably felt themselves put upon by their educational institutions. Ugh, in order to graduate, I have to take 2 humanities courses. Fine, I'll take this one and that one, and resented the hell out of being there the whole time. Those would be the classes, of course, in which they said, oh, this is bullshit anyway. Code is everything. AI is the future, and it shows in their depositions. Hi, everybody. It's me, David, still your host for the Kagro in the Morning Show after all these years. Thank you for all your continuing support for the show. And if you're listening regularly and still thinking about getting on board as a supporter, well, the time is now. Patreon.com is the easiest way to make recurring subscription-style payments every month, all year round, to keep us going. patreon.com/KagroX brings you to our page where you can sign up with your monthly support. And hey, have you seen our clever new subscription tiers? It's easier than ever to sign up for, say, $1 crisp bill for every information-packed 2-hour show. If you're the plan ahead type, there's even a year-long subscription program that saves you 15% on the cover price. Or it would if there was a cover price, or even a cover, for that matter. patreon.com/KAGROX. Thanks again for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, we got lots to get to here. Let me get through. I think this is still worth doing, summing things up nicely about these depositions. Liz Dye writing about the dodgy bros. And as we were pointing out here, one of the first tasks that they were handed was dismantling the National Endowment for the Humanities, and that this task was handed to people who in all likelihood really resented being forced, if this was even the case in their education, to take humanities classes at all, and just literally never saw the value in any of it. It doesn't teach me how to code, bro, and code is life. And so to hand them the task of dismantling this stuff, particularly if they actually really did resent taking humanities courses, and would then, might actually be in position, as we were saying earlier, the ultimate rate my professors. Not only did I not like taking that class, I thought the whole thing was so dumb. What if I use my new position to cancel the underwriting of the research that keeps these humanities professors in place so that they can try to give us some rounded education on our way through computer code trade school? Well, what if we eliminate it, and then they won't be around to make us take their stupid courses anymore? Anyway, so right up back into the NEH situation. For 6 decades, NEH fulfilled its congressional mandate to support historical and cultural research through mostly small-dollar grants dispersed after an intensive application and peer review. NEH has funded Ken Burns documentaries, Pulitzer Prize-winning literature, and mountains of scholarship that mattered even if it didn't turn a profit. None of that interested Justin Fox and Nate Kavanaugh, the 20-something tech bros dispatched to raise the agency. They'd never worked in government or the humanities, and they didn't know the First Amendment from the Administrative Procedure Act. Not that they would have applied either one of them if they did, but that is certainly true. I'm also not entirely clear whether all of these kids are, in fact, college graduates at all, which ordinarily, I suppose you could lay that aside as, undue emphasis on credentials. But here, the credentials are still, I think, in most schools, a stand-in for having been forced at some point to take at least a couple humanities courses, even if they didn't like them very much, although they may also be Teal fellows who were paid to drop out of college before they fulfilled any of the requirements, much less the humanities requirements. All right. So let's see. It's illustrated here by an embedded Blue Sky post from 404 Media. Nathan Kavanaugh's deposition is offered up here for your perusal. So anyway, Liz continues. They had, however, heard about the deficit, right? Never heard of the First Amendment or the Administrative Procedure Act, but they had heard about the deficit, and they knew about DEI, which the president supposedly banned by executive order his first day back in the White House. And now thinking of Justin Fox continually saying, well, I can define DEI, despite the fact that I can't. I'm saying I can. I define it by being what the EO said, even though he never read the EO. And a lot of people keep intimating that this is the lawyer's instruction, blame it on the president. But I'm not so certain that that's the case. But they never really digested what it was, and I can't say what it is. I certainly can't tell you what my thoughts on it are, either because I have none or because I know they're incriminating. But just referring back to the executive order. But it's also important here to say, as Liz does, the president supposedly banned DEI by his executive order. Well, I just kept referring to the EO. Well, what if the EO doesn't mean anything in particular? Like, one, because it's poorly drafted. Two, doesn't actually represent the will of the president because Stephen Miller wrote it anyway. And three, it's purporting things that aren't true and are illegal. And you are just saying, I'm going to do more illegal things based on the, nonsense, illegal garbage I was handed. But of course, if you had, I don't know, a lesson in civics, you might have said, I can't do this. Anyway, next up here in his subheaders, present at the destruction, New York Times reporter Jennifer Schussler has meticulously documented the destruction of the NEH and others since the beginning, and the lawsuits filed by the Authors Guild and the American Council of Learned Societies supply thousands of pages of first-hand accounts. But there's something about seeing a callow young man blank out when asked why he destroyed so much that really brings home the mindless destruction of this campaign. And it's the clip of Justin Fox not being able to explain what DEI is, after all. Fox and Kavanaugh instructed NEH staff to rate the agency's active grants for the presence of DEI, gender ideology, and environmental justice. Stuff that's dumb and gay, as they like to say. When this failed to yield enough cuts, Fox and Kavanaugh turned to ChatGPT, feeding it the database of grants and instructing it to flag anything that relates to DEI, even though they didn't even know what they were asking it. A $349,000 grant, for instance, to replace the HVAC system, the air conditioning, at High Point Museum in North Carolina, that came up as DEI. Because according to ChatGPT, it, quote, enhances preservation conditions for collections, aligning with the goal of providing greater access to diverse audiences. That's the quote. So, diverse audiences, that's DEI. Can I just pause and clear that up for a second? They wanted a federal grant to replace the HVAC system in the museum. And I know, grant writing, it's sometimes pretty dumb and whatever, but they're basically asking, all right, you want money from the federal government for this grant. What is it you're doing? This is the National Endowment for the Humanities. Well, we want to replace the HVAC system. Well, what does that have to do with the humanities? That's a trade. What, you want to talk to the Department of Energy about that? No, we're saying this furthers the aims of the National Endowment of the Humanities by making it possible for us to remain open as a museum and not have our collection rot in the humidity because we keep it climate controlled. And as long as we're open and we have displays, then a diverse community in the area can come and enjoy our display. We can remain open it's a little bit contrived and they're trying to hammer it into this shape here. But, you could go if you had a big enough program at the Department of Energy for upgrading and improving the efficiency of your HVAC, you could have gone in that direction too. But you went here. All right. So the NEH reviews it. And if they say, look, all right, it's not writing a novel, it's not putting in an art installation, but it is making art accessible by keeping a museum open, sure, fine, go ahead. But ChatGPT said, if you're going to show something to a diverse audience, it's a no. Pretty unthinking and stupid. There's another one, a documentary about the Colfax Massacre, the 1873 slaughter of black Louisiana freedmen, one of the bloodiest atrocities of Reconstruction, canceled, quote, because it focuses on exclusively anti-black violence, which is race. You know, black, that's race, so out. That's the level of discourse they're having with ChatGPT. And if you're just not trained in anything but coding, I guess, and trusting your computers, but no rhetorical ability, no reasoning ability, no humanities understanding, the computer says, kill it, so I killed it. You could otherwise look and say, well, this is history, and the people it happened to are black, and that is a race, but we don't cancel it because it said something about race. You can logic your way through it. A project to digitize local newspaper archives. Sounds good. Nixed. Why? Digital accessibility aligns with DEI goals of inclusivity and representation. And remember, there's an awful lot of grants you can kill this way because at the time the grants were applied for, it was the Biden administration, you were encouraged to show that you were aligning yourselves with strategies and to implement DEI programs and expand your reach and make sure that your reach was equitable and inclusive. So you said so, even if it didn't really have all that much to do with the operation you were funding in the grant. You said so because that was a governmental goal. If it isn't anymore, that's one thing. But to say it can't be ever, and we're not going to allow it to be because an administration I didn't like once liked it, is pretty stupid. And then, of course, to ask ChatGPT, just find me the words that'll be in almost everything because we think it's indicative of something real, and can't tell when it's not, is a terrible way to handle this assignment, right? There was another one, a documentary about Jewish women's slave labor during the Holocaust, flagged as DEI because it focused on gender and religious oppression. And I think Justin Fox has a back and forth with that, about that with the lawyers. Give us an example of it. Well, see, why did you cancel a Holocaust historical grant? Well, because, I don't know, gender. Like, there's a seed in there. You can explain it. It's a bad explanation, but he can't even get to the bad explanation. He just doesn't know. In short, every bit of scholarship or art involving anyone who isn't white, male, and able was cut. On April 1st, fittingly enough, I guess, termination notices went out informing more than 1,400 grantees that their funding was being terminated immediately to allow the agency to redirect the funds in furtherance of the president's agenda. Despite grant language allowing for appeals, like it's written into the rules of grants, if you get canceled, there's an appeal process. The letter warned that there was no recourse because, quote, adherence to the traditional notification process is not possible because we don't know what it is and we don't care. That's what's not possible. 3 days later, Fox and Kavanaugh placed 80% of NEH employees on administrative leave. Now, it definitely wasn't going to be possible. We can't have an appeals process because we fired all the appeals people. Next, awful and unlawful. If all this sounds wildly illegal, that's because it is. Congress has the power of the purse, and it allocated $207 million to NEH for fiscal year 2025, with $192 million designated for grants. The president and his henchmen may believe in their hearts that Congress's appropriations are wasteful, but they can't just decide not to spend the money. They can't. They did. Although the Supreme Court has certainly gone out of its way to suggest maybe they can. Arbitrarily canceling grants for no reason and denying grant recipients the review process they've been promised clearly violates both due process and the Administrative Procedure Act. Discriminating against grantees because they are non-white or women or LGBTQ+ violates the Equal Protection Clause. And targeting grantees for the content of their speech is textbook First Amendment violation. And so, in July, Judge Colleen McMahon of the Southern District of New York granted the Authors Guild plaintiffs a partial preliminary injunction. By then, it was clear that the Supreme Court was going to allow the government to treat all grantees like creditors, forcing them to line up for a refund at the Court of Federal Claims. But the Trump administration was threatening to obligate the money elsewhere. That is, spend the money on something else so that it would never be available to grantees. That's what Judge McMahon enjoined, saying, while I cannot order that the withdrawn grant funding be paid out, I can certainly direct that those funds not be reobligated pendente lite. Essentially, I can enter an order that these funds be escrowed until we can hold a trial. Enjoining the reobligation of funds means that money will be available should, for example, the government conclude that the better part of valor is to conduct a constitutionally compliant do-over, a process that could lead to the reinstatement of some or all of the grants. That do-over never happened. Instead, the defendants spent 6 months doggedly trying to bury the evidence of what they'd done. They claimed attorney-client privilege, deliberative process privilege, executive privilege, virtually everything except marital privilege. This stonewalling cut zero mustard with Judge McMahon, who ordered discovery all the way up to the White House and down to the NEH and every place in between, including this entity known as Dodgy. In a handwritten memo endorsement, it's a New York thing, she explains, she wrote, I am quite tired of your discovery disputes. The documents must be produced by Monday, even if Monday is a federal holiday. I will not modify the schedule for briefing purposes in this letter, as I have already signed off on it. P.S. I am not interested in further argument. Produce the documents now. Is that unclear in any way? But, like everyone else in this administration, the Dodgy Bros can't produce their communications because they did so much of it over Signal, ensuring that messages would immediately disappear into the ether. This violates the Federal Records Act and is currently the subject of a motion for sanctions because they clearly spoliated evidence in anticipation of litigation. Burn the evidence, right? On March 6th, 2026, the plaintiffs filed a motion for summary judgment. But even if they win, it won't unmake this catastrophe. The scholars whose work was canceled, whose book projects were interrupted mid-chapter, who took leave from their jobs for projects that never materialized, whose tenure is now in jeopardy, will never get that back. Next up, irony is dead. When he was deposed this January, Fox said he joined Dodgy to work with other hardworking people and address the spending deficit. But of course, the deficit has ballooned under Trump. Dodgy saved no money at all, although it did manage to withhold several $100 million of congressionally mandated spending, and yet Fox insisted his work was at least somewhat successful. I guess he says in his deposition, I think having somebody check to see where taxpayer dollars were going, that was an unbiased third-party auditor of common sense approach to spending, has never happened before in the history of the government, and now we've established that it's possible. It hadn't happened because it was done illegally, and they just went ahead and did it anyway. It didn't make any particular sense, but whatever. I do feel it was a success in the sense that people will be more understanding that these aren't just numbers on a page. They add up to something that's bigger than what they're working on. And I think that in that way, it was successful. A 26-year-old commerce major used ChatGPT to upturn thousands of people's lives. And he says it was all worthwhile because he proved that the dollars spent aren't just numbers on a page. The mind boggles. Of course, the money had to be spent on something, and so NEH went looking for recipients who aren't DEI, whatever that means. Current projects focus on George Washington, Mark Twain, and Flannery O'Connor. Great Americans, but hardly ones who lack for scholarly investigation. And in its largest single grant ever, NEH recently awarded $10.4 million to the Tikva Fund, a conservative Jewish organization with ties to the agency's current leadership, the NEH's current leadership, to combat the normalization of anti-Semitism in American society by focusing on the study of Jewish civilization. The outside scholarly council voted not to recommend it, but Michael McDonald, NEH's acting head who cooperated with Kavanaugh and Fox, overruled them. Now, clearly, the Tikva Fund grant wouldn't have passed the ChatGPT, quote, DEI test, but intellectual consistency was never the point of this exercise. This was an act of wanton destruction by proudly ignorant young men who neither know nor care about the law or history or even basic civics. As ACLS president, and I think that's the legal or the scholarly groups that are suing, as ACLS President Joy Connolly put it, our lawsuit reveals this administration's contempt for that principle and for public investment in research for the common good. Dodgy's employees' use of ChatGPT to identify, quote, wasteful grants is perhaps the biggest advertisement for the need for humanities education, which builds skills in critical thinking. Too bad for any of that. Okay, well, it was an interesting take and well worth our time. Let me bring you another story here. We're going to shift gears and turn things over once again. After a little while, it's been a while, Rosalind McGregor has a Michigan update for us that I think you'll find interesting, and we've got to get it on record here before we head into the weekend. Rosalind, please.
Good morning, David. I know that you enjoy a process article, and I have a meaty one for you today. I'd like to bring to your listeners' attention the fact that this coming November, Michiganders will be asked to vote on whether or not we hold a state constitutional convention in 2027. I'm bringing this up in the context of Michigan being a border state with good relations with Canada, plus the increasingly dictatorial and fascist policies of Donald Trump and his cronies. A February YouGov survey of about 27,000 U.S. adults found that roughly 1 in 5 Americans are in favor of their state seceding. Views on what Americans would want their state to do if it were to secede vary significantly based on where they live. Desire to join Canada and Mexico is higher in states that border those countries. Joining Canada is far more appealing to secession-minded Democrats than Republicans. Democrats who want their state to secede are 5 times as likely as Republicans to prefer joining Canada, which is 31% versus 6%. The YouGov poll estimates 15% of Michiganders would like to secede. A constitutional convention would be the opportunity to lay the foundation for Michigan to become the 11th Canadian province. The question of whether a state can lawfully succeed has been a topic of debate for centuries, and the legal and constitutional aspects of secession are complex. The topic tends to come up when people feel their rights are not being protected or when they seek to redress grievances. Looking at petitions on the We the People website, citizens from all 50 states have expressed their desire to secede. On November 3rd, Proposal 1 will ask Michigan voters whether a constitutional convention should be convened for the purpose of a general revision of the 1963 Michigan Constitution. Article 7, Section 3 of the Michigan Constitution provides that in 1978 and every 16 years thereafter, the question of a general revision of the Constitution shall be submitted to voters. If the question is approved, the convention would convene in Lansing on October 5th, 2027. If rejected, it will automatically be presented to voters again in 2042. While Michigan voters rejected calls for convention rewrites by wide margins in 1978, 1994, and 2010, this year's proposal already has a prominent champion, Michigan House Speaker Matt Hall, who recently publicly endorsed the concept. During the 2025 Mackinac Policy Conference, Hall, a Republican of Richland Township, and Senate Minority Leader Eric Nesbitt, Republican from Porter Township, backed the effort to call a constitutional convention. Democratic leaders in the state legislature, meanwhile, so far have been non-committal or not taken positions. In the 62 years since the current Constitution was ratified in 1963, voters have approved 39 of 85 amendments put on the ballot through petition drives or legislative action. It would take 3 elections to give Michigan a new constitution, one to hold a convention, a second to elect the delegates that would do the revising, and a third for Michigan voters to decide whether to adopt their changes. If voters do approve a constitutional convention in 2026, the delegate election would happen within the following 6 months. Representation would mirror the state legislature, or 1 delegate for every House and Senate district, or 148 people in total. These constitutional delegates would then convene for a convention and work without a deadline on revisions. They could simply offer 1 or more amendments to the existing Constitution, or they could start over from scratch and rewrite the whole thing. While Hull viewed it as an avenue to remove provisions from the state's constitution that he said sounded good on paper but have raised frustrations with voters, Nesbitt viewed it as an opportunity to make updates to the document that politicians in Lansing haven't had the political courage to actually get done. Quote, "When you open up a constitution, you open up everything," said Patrick Wright, vice president for legal affairs at the Mackinac Center, a conservative think tank. Typically, opponents argue that opening Michigan's constitution would invite unwelcome extremist proposals that would enshrine into the document every pet peeve of the moment. Passing the proposal would call for seating a convention of 148 delegates. Currently sitting legislators are not allowed. The large size of the delegation is an argument in support of reasonable results, as has happened 3 times in the state's history. And when all is said and done, the final version must be approved by Michigan voters. Quote, "For the most part, stakeholders are currently in wait-and-see mode. That's in part because the national political climate will have a lot to do with voters' appetite to overhaul state government," said Adrian Hammond, a Democratic strategist with the bipartisan grassroots Midwest firm in Lansing. This is one of those rare horseshoe issues where Republicans and Democrats can agree to revamp the 1963 Michigan Constitution, but for very different reasons. Depending on how bad things get nationally, this could be a golden opportunity to move Michigan progressively forward. Who knows what condition our country will be in on October of 2027, when the delegates would first gather to revise the state's constitution. There's going to be a lot on the line this November, and now your listeners can say they know all about Proposal 1 facing Michigan voters. Back to you, David.
All right. You're not going to get anything, any meatier process than constitutional conventions, whether statewide or otherwise. Very interesting, and totally off of my radar, and well worth the investment in your time. Rosalind, thanks so much for that one. Keep an eye out. Never too early to alert people to what's going on their November ballots, especially when it's that consequential. What an interesting process, too, to set this thing out and say, every 16 years we should reconsider whether we want to have a constitutional convention. It's a little bit scary considering what some people's ideas are for holding a federal constitutional convention. But at least if you have an orderly process, I suppose you can do things without blowing things up, at least in Michigan. Anyway, I don't know. Maybe it's maybe this one will go overboard. But all right, and certainly not on my issue radar. Great Friday story. Thanks so much for making the contribution of the story to us, Rosalind. And here now, as we end the show for the day and for the week, I want to bring something else to your attention. And all I can really do with the time we got left, Radley Balco has been posting, rather urgently and frantically about an article that he found to be, as he puts it, astonishingly great reporting. It feels like something at first blush in this description, like, hey, we've gotten that one. We've gotten that through the vibes. But I guess there's something about this particular article that really struck him as worthwhile of his time, and maybe it will be yours too. All the crises, he says, that the White House has claimed over the last 14 months were planned in advance. All of them. And however much contempt you have for media outlets who reverently relayed Trump's claim to have no relation to Project 2025, it isn't enough. It is a piece in the Phoenix New Times under the title of Insurrectionist Brunch. Trumpists plotted to deploy military on U.S. soil. I didn't realize that was a part of it. But before the 2024 election, a cadre of MAGA loyalists met over brunch, literally, I guess, to plot ways for Trump to use the military domestically. It is Bo Hodai, Hodai, who's doing the reporting. It's a March 10th article. Again, the Phoenix New Times. I can give you a flavor of the way it leads off, but it's a long and involved article, and it's really got Radley Balco's attention, and that's a pretty good recommendation. And apparently this all took place at the Army-Navy Country Club in Arlington, Virginia. And I guess really if we begin reading you the lead, it'll all be sort of scene setting more than anything else. But Balco kind of goes on with displaying a couple of page screenshots of the most important passages in his view and saying it's all there. All the BS claims, yeah, he uses a real word, claims about emergencies and national security threats. The goal all along was to give Trump the power to deploy the military domestically to suppress dissent and crush MAGA's enemies. Kind of feel like we've vibed our way to that one by now, but still, these are dangerous people. They're now in the highest levels of government. These people were openly plotting to manufacture false pretenses to undermine federal law and overthrow the constitutional order. Clark, that's Jeff Clark, you remember him, the ringleader, was already under indictment for conspiring to overturn the 2020 election, and then we just put them all in power again. It is kind of odd and hard to believe, but I guess in the context of knowing Chris Rufo keeps explicitly laying out the plans up to and including, my plan is to tell the media the wrong thing and watch them believe it and then launch my crusade based on that wrong thing once they swallow it hook, line, and sinker. And then they do it, and then people publish, hey, look, this is his plan, or he said he was going to lie to you. Why don't you ever call him out on it? And everybody kind of shrugs their shoulders and, hey, I don't know. Well, same game plan appears to have worked for Project 2025. Time now, though, for us to take our exit for the day and for the week and hand things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Let's see what we got on tap here. Oh, Trump had a 12:30 a.m. meltdown, did he? All right.
From networksradio.com.
Well, we'll see what that's about. I missed that one.
You have been listening to Kagro in the morning with David Waldman.
Plenty to get to, of course. Plenty we missed, and Justice Putnam will back clean up for us once again. We leave it all to you. We'll be back on Monday. Greg Dworkin will visit us. It's time to start thinking about the No Kings protests coming up in 2 weeks on the 28th of March, and we've got a musical interlude that will help you get ready that we can introduce you to next week.